Okay. Camera. What is it? Okay. Okay, we can start. We only have two presentations because Susanna Monceau is not with us. She had problems. So our first presentation is by Patrick Maynard. So I leave the floor immediately to him. 25 minutes for the presentation and 15 for the description. Thank you.
Some off-the-cuff comment ahead of time is that I read this ahead for timing, and when I read it ahead for timing, I had to be changing it just for sound and content, and then on the airplane again, the more, and then I decided I better give you a warning. This paper is really in two pieces, the first part will work on its title, Forms of Norms, Pathways to Normativities. And here, in the first part, particularly, you'll see I'm following out one of Kristen's ideas, and what I'm not doing is using my reading glasses. Could somebody get my bag? I'm using them. I broke them yesterday in the case. So just watch this. This will happen to you. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of time. It just happens. The systems start falling apart, and I even used super glue on the glasses, and it broke it because of the case. Thank you so much. Gretchen. The optometrist told me off and said I should not use the soft case, so I got a hard case. So I closed it under it, broke it. It's okay. So another norm tried to give me. Yeah. Oh, that looks much better. So I have slides, but the slides aren't large enough for you to read. But pathways to normativities, and I'm going to deal with pathways, and I'm not being cute. It's not meta. It's pathways in the sense of Kristen. I'll give her that sharp, not Latin Kristen, but Kristen, the Kristen pronunciation. And then the second, but overall, is the different theoretical pathways to our subject. So there's that, in my case, my good friend Giuseppe invites me under our common interest in what he called non-linguistic mentality, activity. I work largely in, I don't know, visual stuff, I guess you'd call it. I mean, not as a philosopher, but yeah. So that's how I get into these conferences. So what usually happens is I'm doing something, writing something, and Giuseppe invites me to a conference on something. It could be on legal contracts or something like that. And then I try to get to his topic from what I'm doing. So that does lead to certain strains, as you all know. That will account for the break in this. Because in the second part, I'm going to get into the work that I've been doing and trying to finish on intentionality, notably on levels or orders of intentionality, and in my case, patterns of the orders of intentionality, especially pattern 5. I don't know how quite, I wound up writing about that, but my main background interest, I'm glad has already come up with Kristen, and this is artifacts. And that comes out of a lot about art. A lot of the so-called problems about art, particularly visual art, is because people haven't thought about what artifacts are. Artifacts are highly intentional objects. And as Tomasello says, an artifact is a thing with intentional affordances. An animal, do they identify something as an artifact, a tool, or just something with natural affordances for doing something? Our acculturation and resulting norms, etc., with tools with which we're ruining the world for the other animals, is full of norms, and I'm going to be dealing with that in the latter part of this talk, in terms of my intentionality levels or orders. I say levels because some people, for orders, they want it to be propositional. And I don't see how their theory gets going. And I think that was a problem with Donald Davidson. Once you start on the propositional foot, which is language again, you cannot get to another step. But always, in my case, working in art as well as in philosophy, in these two parts of my brain, I didn't think that I had, that was a very good way in. So, so I sometimes speak just of intentional levels. I don't see how a child can have intentionality order one in a propositional sense. I mean, what they start with a language, that's nonsense. And how do they get to two? Level two, where they have these false belief tests, etc. They're so interested in order two. Well, actually, it's a dialectic, as our friend Vygotsky, that I'll be talking about, says, between the orders, back and forth. And you can't start with the big step. The big step continues to build our first order, so-called, our sense of self, numero uno, as they say in El Norte. It grows for our whole lives. Of course, our sense of self changes and grows and develops. And there is an interaction. There is a dialectic between the levels and orders. Now, I won't go into the history of that interest because I spoke about it at a different conference here. But I'm just warning you that in the second part, I tend to go back to that, and I'm going to try to keep it from being too complicated. So, introduction, which I call norms of norms. It depends on what we mean by norm and normativity. That's how I expect much of our workshop to go. As I also expect it will sometimes mean rather different things, most of my attempted contribution will be to present a broad norm conception that isn't centered on moral or legal matters, but rather more in a wider realm of social ontology, which our normativity group is very much working on. Well, what on this approach is an example of a norm? That is, what might be my norm of norms? That's on the screen. Others, I expect, will have rather different ones. Men wearing ties at conferences like these. When I try to think, what is the norm? 50 years ago, one did de rigueur, and that's what the word means. When I asked myself when this stopped, I realized that I had my own files, drawn from decades of conferences. Here are some samples. I'm sorry you can't see them better. But I don't know if you can read the dates on these things. Good heavens, there's through the years. The one at the bottom is a Dretske conference when his his book about the flow of information came out. We had a conference. The fellow next to him who has dark hair still is Dan Dennett. You can see what does that say? 70 something, 76 or something? Someone who's close. Can you see the date down there? You can't quite read it. Okay, as you can see on the left, Dretsky and then Dennett, they have jackets on, but probably not ties. And then as you keep moving on, you see a change in sartorial norms. And anyway, I can tell you that up at the top is Foucault, when I was at Berkeley in 1983, and there he is, jacket and tie. To the left is Stefan Baumgarten, who died a little while ago, saying that we have to become obsolete. Down in the blue is David Lewis. And this is even earlier. I forget if that's in the 60s. And to the right of my label there is why am I blocking on his name? Yes, we all know who he is. You can see why. What does it say on him? Label? To the right? Oh, I'm being silly. And then further to the right, you'll see our friend now with gray hair. At the bottom, you'll see a conference in Santa Barbara, and the guy in the middle has fallen asleep. I have possibly hundreds of these drawings, and many of ladies. I assure you. I'm sorry you can't. You were meant to be reading the Grunbaum comments while I was reading. So that's the first example. Later, I'll give a more extensive one of artifacts. Artifacts of norms. But what generally are norms on the conception of music? The talk's title is a play on the art historian Ernst Gombrich's Norm and Form, which was originally given in Italian as Norma e Forma, regarding ideas of style in art. So it might have been in plural, forme e norme, if I have it right. Since one of its themes is, like Professor Andrews, the plurality of types of norms. Thus, whether within that plurality we can identify some other creature's behavior, because we have different ideas of norm. To report where I'm coming from, while norm topics are important for style in art, for example, Gombrich, the lasting norm of classical orders and modern art's attempts to break with them. By the way, in terms of what Kristen was saying yesterday, one of the ideas that has so dominated the idea of the idea in the mind that we were talking about, and then the artist goes to the page. A center for that, according to his, is the understanding of Raphael's comment when asked how he did this beautiful Madonna, and according to my Sardinian colleague at the University of Western Ontario, not here, Sonio Maras, the Italian is that Raphael said, there being in Rome a famine of beautiful women, I used a certain idea in my mind. and they got that. I was going to look that up last night to get it into the Italian. And so there is that idea, and that's his normative form. This norm, the classical norm, is such a powerful thing. And so much of the understanding of modern art and architecture is in terms of struggling with and against that classical order. So the orders of course, still exist in architecture, and that they just work so well that they get adapted with that norm. Some people, I think, are struggling too hard against the norm, and they're making ridiculous ships that aren't made for human beings, that don't have wings, and they throw horrible shadows and all things like that. Okay, but regarding pathways, my current research hasn't been about art, except insofar as it reveals, quote, what makes us human. For example, as Giuseppe argues, in our being gnomic creatures. Part one, a Vygotskian pathway. This is the general one. This is what will take you as you get ready for Tom Sell, the next position. I'm glad somebody said a big guy. For me, this pathway has several branches, which I'll present as linked but separate, since this is a workshop, in the hope that some parts of it interest some parts of you. Now, I begin with the tri-square, and where do we go? Can I do this right? Yes. I'm gonna buy you a new projector and also get swivel the camera. I'll send you a check. For me, and most broadly, what makes us human topic that I've been working on, I've been taking that path in a Vygotskian direction after the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky's ideas on human freedom through rules. For example, he says, in play, and I've been doing a lot of this, in games of many sorts, notably make-believe games, that Vygotsky argued, small children come to accept rules, arbitrary ones as beyond the laws of nature. They're beyond, they're in addition to, they're not violations of, but we invent rules. This begins with games, our own rules. We get freedom by adding to the rules that we comply with, because these are rules that are ridiculous, and yet we comply with them. That's our freedom. Not sure. Thereby in acts of personal and cultural freedom from nature. While insisting that any game of make-believe is defined by rules, he stated that, quote, Vygotsky, the creation of the make-believe situation is not a fortuitous fact in a child's life, but rather the first manifestation of a child's emancipation from situational constraints by inventing our own. Consistent then with Durkheim's perception as cited by Giuseppe, that all people exist, quote, enmeshed in a form of social normativity that is objective. In Vygotsky's idea that we nonetheless derive freedom by inventing games of clearly arbitrary, even manifestly silly actions. I mean, the sports prescribed by rules of our own invention. Just in terms of games, this play interest continues to be a significant part of adult lives, cultures, and economies. That is, of social ontology. And it is pretty amazing how we invent those norms and how much they mean to so many people. They just changed some in American baseball. Thus, norms in terms of free actions. Throughout, I suggest we keep in mind the Vygotskian point, this one, that norms are basically guides. Things of our making, put separate from us for our purposes. This is the human sense of norms. Thus, we speak of following, consulting, appealing to, or as was just stressed by the last speaker, departing from norms, whether they're laws or not. Here we may call on etymology, whereby, pardon, the root for norm, according to Webster and Oxford, at least for English, is a set square. That's what a norma was, something that we use. Norma in Latin, not nomos in Greek. With this norm, of norm. Questions about animal norms would, to some extent, concern kinds of animal freedom, whether animals consult guides in acting, things outside themselves in acting. I realize that such a norm of norms sets a rather high cognitive standard, maybe too high at this conference, but it may still help us understand various kinds of creatures in terms of a better understanding of our own norms and what they are, artifacts. Now, research, Tomasello's developmental pathways. Regarding research, a prominent recent Vygotskian pathway of the self-described neo-Vygotskian psychologist Michael Tomasello proceeds developmentally, both philo and ontogenetically. Tomasello's phylogenetic, what makes us human argument, is essentially social, where he has made it negatively with regard to animals, and this has drawn a certain amount of criticism, notably regarding other great apes. In brief, for Tomasello, quote, the ultimate source of human uniqueness, end quote, is our capacity for joint intentionality, our sense of we. And then he claims, and this is what's contentious, lacking in apes. So lacking that sense of we, they cannot join, they do not join in joint intentionality, and that impacts the question of norm. Lacking a consciousness of we'd be lacking a sense of what we do as opposed to what they do, and thus lacking a basis for social norms to guide us. Gosh, I hope you can see that my birds, I photographed those in my backyard last week. Damn it. Oh, well. This is the difference between norms and swarms of behavior. Norme e sham. Norme. To be short, humans swarm, as is periodically tragically shown in the news. But such is, pardon me, no more norm-conforming behavior than that is of starling murmurations or Professor Anthony's Mormon crickets. I have other things to say about Mormons. I agree, well, but I've been in Salt Lake City, but which, although collective, are not coordinated, not in accordance with an external, with a norm. I shouldn't say external, with a norm. This shows over my back garden, 3 kinds of corvids. In fact, swarming a red kite, which have recently been reintroduced into Britain very successfully, huge project, very successful, and they fly over our house, absolutely lovely. And that kite is I have a line over there, and if you look among them, you'll see, if you could see them, one of the corvids has a very whitish patch, which means that it's either a rook or I get them, jackdaw. That's yeah, it's a jackdaw. There are 2 jackdaws that nest on the neighbors' chimneys. Mainly, we have crows. Right? But I didn't want to just say crow, jackdaw. So this is that difference. And I think that if you could see it, that this would be a very interesting case for your discussions, because these are three different species of corvidae, and they group in certain ways around us. There's a certain tree that they fly to in the evening where the crows gather. And this, I would go further into this with talking about cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. I don't think there's any collaborative behavior here. A pattern forms which is collaborative, but it is cooperative because they aren't bothering each other, and that they're letting the other ones fly past. The extent to which it's coordinated would be questionable. I mean, I hardly think it's coordinated towards a joint goal. It's coordinated by individual, and like the bees and the ants, or like if you're one of my daughter's a ballet dancer, and when you're the first one out in the swans, in the swans, even if you're wrong, everybody has to copy the one in front of them. They have to be in step, even if the first one is off beat. So when she had that role, it's very important. And it's only that way that the whole thing has this very moving effect. And I could go on and give a paper about how moving Swan Lake is and how it's not the central pair. You have to see it from the balcony. It's the swans, the whole group of swans. And at the end, they defeat Rothbard. The swans, by their will, by their sense of we, they allow the hero and heroine to perish in defeating Rothbard. But it's only at the point when they get together in a we that you don't have here. It's terribly moving. George Balanchine's, in fact, there are a couple of movies based on that, and people haven't noticed it, but where it's not the hero. It's what my eldest brother, the psychologist, called the Holy Spirit, humanity, when it acts together as a we. So I don't think they're doing that, but they are upholding their corporate activity. Now, it's important to note that Tomasello's denial of joint intentionality or any sense of we in any other ape isn't due to a denial, for those who don't know this, of their psychological powers of so-called mind reading, boring term, TON, cohorts. He argues that there, in fact, is that there's strong empirical evidence of apes not only detecting but imagining others' points of view, an important power which we inherit with them from a common ancestor. I add briefly that Tomasello's Evo-Devo position here, that shows that I anticipated the sliding on proto-conversation by a few years. Good old, terrible old camera, good old film, best picture. I add briefly that that his Evo-Devo position here is that our own species, with baby onto development, features two important kinds of behavior that intersect the maturing of our great ape mentalizing power. Thereby, he thinks, producing joint intentionality. That's the biologist's view and the evolutionist view. And then from which comes joint agency, which he denies to the apes. The first stage, from at least birth, maybe earlier, according to Treverton, maybe from the womb, is imitative proto-conversation, sharing with mothers. And there you are. The imitation, looking into the eyes of the other, mimicking, smiling, and so on. Now he claims apes, don't do this. So this is the first step. And then by 9 months, here comes your triangle. The second by 9 months is the attentional triangle of pointing with not just mothers, but lots of others from that book, Mothers and Others, whereby the important process of triangulation begins, providing that great norm of a common real world as taken from different perspectives. What we're doing. So, we. According to Tomasello, neither capacity appears in other apes, which accordingly lack human agency, abilities with joint agency. For they remain basically, rivalless. They're developing mentalizing, mainly of, get ready for this, mainly mentalizing, mainly of Machiavellian motivation. How's that for alliteration? Absent a sense of we, which is the basis for social normativity's how we do things force. Humans, of course, tragically, retain much of this, I believe, in conflict or partly harmonized through tribalism, the rivalous form of we. Back that Plato wrote against. Back to ontogeny, where Tomasello provides an interesting argument, again from Child's Play. Before make-believe play, beginning with that newborn proto-conversation that's characterized by back and forth turn-taking practices from which developed a sense of roles. However, games and many games with children are back and forth, peekaboo and hide and seek. I do this, I do that. Roles, where the role is separated, there's Tomasello, from the agent. And from that, he says that something very important develops, and that is what he didn't talk about norms, where the norm is separate. This is what, for example, Donald Trump doesn't understand. He was in a role. He's no longer in the role. He doesn't get to keep the stuff that was there. He doesn't get to keep all of his files and having people troop after him. He doesn't understand the basic distinction that a child does, the difference between a role and the person. Now, this, which isn't even back and forth, is a pretty standard game you'll find in nursery school. It's called parachute. Now, any of the children could be at any of the points. The important thing is that you keep up your side. And you find soon that you act together to get the balls to jump up and down. Otherwise, it's just a mess and they fall on the ground. So you find this standardly in nursery school. It's a very good way of teaching roles, cooperation, roles, and the distinction between moi, as Miss Piggy put it, and a role. Yes. 5 minutes. Well, okay. 6. Well, I won't get to those other things then. I'm sorry. I won't get to.
We have to ask to our leader.
See, I thought I had a little extra time because we had a paper.
I'm following the rule you said there.
Okay. And the next.
Okay, the difference between the role and
then after him comes lunch.
Yeah.
One we have. Okay, so I see.
So we can.
Okay, I'll give you a little bit more, but at least I give you another picture, because this. How do you go back? Forward, which I just took, and I see the trouble is that this is dialogue. So I want to interact with the people. For example, this is on the violation of the roles. He's almost 4. And when he comes into the room, he takes all the CDs and throws them on the floor. And he takes the baking pans out of the under the stove and arranges them on the floor and walks on them, etc. So he all of them, and he sets up his own. So that's one of his artifacts, and it's quite typical. And then you're not, of course, you're not going to break that. You have to crawl under it, it's quite wonderful. Also, if you see how it's been constructed, because his tape wasn't long enough, so he stuck a little plastic in there. and also what he's wearing is a dragon costume that was made. And from that position, when he was 2.5 years old, I came in and said, 2.5 years old, I came in and said to him, "How are you, my boy?" And he said, "Oh my Lord." God. Okay, so other ontogenies, I'll leave that out. Other phylogenies. Okay, back to our topic. Other phylogenies. Yes, and I'll say something, and it's not really anti-Tomasello, but not the way to take a Tomasello. An easy fallacy from Tomasello's work with apes, which he spent nearly 30 years. But if he's wrong, but even if he's right, we should not make the following fallacy. What if animal norms in our interactions with, I guess I can skip that part too. Oh yes, and we come to what I call long animal tracks. And that is, the fallacy would be to suppose that since we are a great ape that is evolved off this other line of great ape, we count ourselves as cognitively highly the most advanced. If it's true that we have joint intentionality and the other ones don't, and thus we have norms of very high level, and that the other ones don't, it's a fallacy to infer that therefore no other animal has them, because there may be other animal tracks. On Tomasello's own argument, what prohibits the other great apes is there being rivals. What about creatures that are not rivals? Then they wouldn't have that blocker. And is it possible that they could get the other two things, or some form of the other two things, such that they could get joint intentionality? And in fact, they wouldn't even have to form tribes to work between the rivalry and the sense of we. You see, the awful thing we've done is we've taken our sense of we, our wonderful Holy Ghost, and then we've maintained it, as Plato argued, by rivalry against other groups. Nationalisms, I mean, sports groups, great, but look what we're doing. Look what we're doing. At this stage, oh my God. So I can at least get to that point, and then I won't do my 5 levels of intentionality. What I argue there is that I'll just say what.
That is a good start.
Yeah, well, see, I'm a good salesman. This is what you learn from 40 years of teaching. It's an act, and that is, and you take off your glasses. And that is the yeah. Stop. I'll stop. There's some more. Yeah. See, the trouble is these other papers came before, and then they worked into my paper because this is what they call a workshop. Tappy tap tap tap. This is not a production line. This is a workshop. This is back and forth. This is dialogue. This is forming the sense of we for at least a small time, which calls out our inherited sense, our what my brother Hugo called Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, and our powerful abilities at looking at one another and seeing whether you're bored or something like that. But our back and forth, looking in the eyes, and disagreements, differences, wonderful. that's what it is. That's why it's so exciting. That's why I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. Because in the village where I live, besides their English, oh, by the way, I was wondering, and I do generally conferences, could you share all the email addresses of all the people? And then we can continue discussions and in fact, send the paper. I mean, even if it's recorded, you may not look at it. You put it up on YouTube, the recordings?
If you agree.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, sign on the line.
Okay.
It's
Now we
fine.
have 10 minutes for the discussion.
Okay.